Good evening, folks. Welcome to another episode from your Heaven Video production team. I'm Dr. D, and I'm here with our lovely and fascinating guest, April Rains, to tell her story tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here, Dee.
Honey, it's my pleasure, but I think the pleasure is going to be everybody that is tuning in to listen to you. Well, folks, this is a little different than anything that we've done here at CDH and TGH. Uh, April has made the decision to undergo a gender transition. And she made that decision here while she was a member of CDH and TGH. So she is going to tell her story in the first person. And we're going to record a couple of episodes as April progresses through her transition. And we're going to hear about her transition through her eyes and through her own voice. When we're done at the end of a year, so we're going to do this as a year-long project, we'll string the episodes together. We'll have a look back and we'll let April offer her thoughts on if I knew then what I know now. But we'll be giving you the intermediate episodes as they come along, and we're going to do these in 15 to 20-minute segments. Well, April, I don't need to keep sucking all the air out of the room, so we're going to get started, and we're going to put you on the spot. So I'm going to give you 3 questions, and I'd like you to address those in your own way, string the story together. We want to know, who is April Rains? Give us your overview. Tell us about your life story, getting you up to this point of your gender-affirming hormone therapy, and then tell us what you see as a story for that gender decision, your medical transition, surgical transition, and social transition. What things you think you might do as you go along.
Right.
All right, dear. Take it.
Okay. Well, I don't know, Dee. I think one of the things that I'd like to say first is that my story is everybody's story. It doesn't matter where we start or where we end in the process. I think and we're each unique, but yet we're very similar. And so my story might be a little different or a little longer, but on that great spectrum of gender and transition, we're all somewhere on there. And so I think the important part of this is to say that I'm no different than anyone else. So who am I? I'm a 70-year-old transgender woman. I was born in the 50s. I'm a child of the 50s and the 60s. One sister. My father was a Korean War Marine. And so back then, if you had thoughts of being wrong in your gender, that wasn't something that you would ever bring up to a Marine father, right? So while I can remember back in my life sometimes where I kind of wandered into my mother's closet and then began the guilt feelings, at 7 or 8. There's a picture that my sister took of me that I'm standing in her peacoat, my underwear and a pair of her heels, having chosen those to go outside and take some garbage out. So I blame her. It's her fault that I am as I am. But, I was a typical child. I wasn't a great athlete, but I did what was expected of me as a son, as a boy. And I pushed away any of those early thoughts, of any different or any concerns. And so for the rest of my life, up until I really started to experience dysphoria, I led a very typical life as a male. I went through high school, I went to college. There was a story that I think, I'd like to relate that occurred when I was a senior in high school. Would have been, I think it was fall of 72-ish or, spring of 73. I was working at a gas station nights and weekends to make money. And so I worked with a gentleman who was the mechanic, and he would teach me things. And, so, I mean, typical stuff that boys would do, right? I mean, it's just normal. We would do with cars. So I was there helping him one day, and he was working in a car that belonged to a young woman. And I guessed that she was probably, in her early 20s, a little older than I was at the time. And she was drop dead gorgeous, Dee. She had beautiful long blonde hair, a wonderful complexion, and she was wearing, typical of the time, short shorts and a t-shirt with no bra. And I can remember distinctly looking at her, and my thought was not that, gee, I'd really like to date this girl. My thought was, I want to be this girl. And I can remember being stunned by that thought, right? And again, something shoved in the back of your mind. I went off to college. I met my wife in my freshman year. I was married as a sophomore in first semester of my sophomore year, and our son was born the next year. I ended up, at that point, I had kind of thought about going into pre-law, but economics said, no, you need to find something else. And I had a strong military example from my father. And so I ended up joining ROTC, and that led me into the Army and a 25 plus year Army career, retiring as a colonel. From there, looking, what was kind of next, I ended up back, we moved back to our home area. We built our house, and I went to work at a local college. Higher education was great because it allowed me to interact with students. And that was the best thing about the Army too. I was interacting with young people all the time. I got a chance to lead. And so as I went into the college, it was very much the same. And so to my great joy and benefit, after 8 years of being there, I ended up as a college president. And stayed there for another 8 years in that role. Just an amazing opportunity and role. So what happened? How did things change for me? And so that was where, probably in my 30s, those thoughts that I thought I had repressed, that I had done away with, started to creep back. I started to question who I was, not really understanding, because again, we didn't talk about gender dysphoria even then. Really, you had some examples of transgender persons, but it really wasn't a mainstream kind of thing. And so I had no idea what was going on, other than I had these weird thoughts and I felt guilty about it. And I wouldn't act out on it. I just, again, tried to bury it. And so then, probably in my 50s, at that point, it started to overpower me, and I started to become depressed. It started to capture my mind, and I started some very minimal cross-dressing, and probably not unusual to how many of us started. And for many of us, that is where we stay, because that's where we find our comfort zone. But for me, it was kind of a progressive thing. And I, wear some women's clothing. I started very simply, as most of us do, and then I'd purge, because I felt guilty, and I had, self-hate, self-loathing, all of those things, all of those emotions that we fight in our lives. That continued on, and it just continued to get worse and worse and worse over time. And then probably in the last 3 years before my egg kind of cracked, I was depressed, clinically depressed, and the gender dysphoria had captured my mind, and I was distracted, and I was not happy. My wife knew there was something wrong. I just wasn't the person that I had been throughout my life. I wasn't happy. It was tough to, and I didn't know how to describe it because, what could I tell my wife at that point, that I liked wearing women's clothing and I felt better when I did that. And then all of a sudden it'd purge and it'd be all gone. So at some point then that depression began to overtake me and I became suicidal. There were points where I was ready to end it all. There were points that I sat with that pistol in my hand, ready to pull that trigger. And to me, it was like, and I continued to describe it this way, that it was like being stalked by a black bear. The bear was always out there circling around me. It was waiting for its opportunity to strike. And if I let down my guard at all, it was there. Just a comment or something would drive me deep into that hole of depression and the bear would be right there. And although I was scared at first, scared of the concept of suicide, at some point, the bear would wrap me in its arms and the fear would go away and I'd be warm. I'd just kind of be engulfed in this shield of protection. And so I can understand how people can get there and can go beyond that, right? Can actually take the action. For me, what brought me back was my wife. And the thought of what I was doing to her, as well as to the rest of my family, but definitely to my wife, what that single act would have done to her, I ultimately was not fair, and that I had to find my way, some way, out of that hole and out of that depression. And so, that I think kind of, I fought that guilt, that shame, that same thing that many of us feel at various times in our lives, and as we find our way through that gender spectrum. But again, not unlike any of us, it's just that perhaps mine went a little farther than most might have. So I think that kind of brings me up to maybe more than people wanted to hear, but it brings me to that point of where my wife got brought into this whole thing.
Well, you've mentioned your wife several times now. You got married to this girl as a sophomore in college.
Yeah.
How many years you got married to this lady?
We were 19 when we got married, and just barely 20 when our son was born. Now, having celebrated our 50th and almost coming up on our 51st anniversary.
Wow. Well, since you brought your wife into this, and your wife is an intimate part of it. So please tell our viewers a little bit more about who's taken this journey with you.
Right. So, my wife, we retired, we moved back here to our house, and, we built our retirement home and began this new life together. And that's, kind of, it was within some of those years that I really kind of fell into that depression, and the dysphoria really began to pull me. And so one day, it was New Year's Day, 2023. I was deeply depressed, full of guilt and shame and any negative thought that you could imagine. And my wife knew it. She saw it in me. She saw the changes in me, and so she chose that morning to say, "What's wrong? I know something is wrong. What's wrong?" And Dee, in a way that I would never recommend any of our members or anyone else to do it, I vomited it all at once. It just came gushing out of me at the time, and part of the what almost got me to that point was I had been playing around with Snapchat not too long before that, trying to it was part of my job at the college to be involved in the various internet, Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram. I had to have a presence out there, so I had some familiarity, and so I decided I was going to try Snapchat, and I found this app that allowed you to change your gender. Go figure, right? And so I took my picture and I hit the filter, and oh my God, staring at me was this, of course, blonde, younger version, filtered version of who you're seeing right now. But I saw that, and it was like, oh my God, that's me. That's who I should be. And that kind of drove me into that pit of despair at that point. So my wife asked the question, I vomited, and that began a process of where I started to realize that I'm not on this alone. This isn't just me. That any decision I'm making affects her just as much as it does me. So I struggled with pieces of this that I struggled in, that she struggled with. We all, when we have a partner, a spouse, we talk about honesty and not lying, telling people what's wrong. And yet I had buried this. I had lived this lie with my wife all of those years. And that, I think, probably almost more than anything is what hurt her. And what I had to begin at that point, assuming that she was going to stay with me, and that wasn't necessarily always the way things could have gone. I had to start rebuilding that trust. And I would also say to people to understand that it's not just once. When you make that commitment, you got to stay with it. And as you take this other person on the journey, you've got to maintain that communication back and forth, so that that you both have an understanding of where you are and of where you're going. So I made the conscious decision. I was a little over 48 years at that point, that I was not going anywhere without my wife going with me, and it's a decision that we each have to make when we're in that position. And I can't tell anybody what decision to make, but for me, that was right. That was what I really wanted to do. And that was my priority. And I committed to taking things very slowly, step by step. I agreed to go into therapy, which was both life-saving and life-changing for me. And I began shortly after that point to go into therapy. It has been now, coming up on 3 years of working together. And it's been wonderful, and it's been difficult at times. I think, it's important for everyone to understand, again, when you bring a spouse or a partner into this, it is a major change for them. And it's, in some respects, almost like the death of a partner, of going through a grief process, because that person, although I can say I'm me, and I am in many respects. I had short hair. I didn't have earrings. I didn't wear makeup or lipstick, right? And I certainly didn't wear women's clothing. And so we do change, to some respect, although we're, down deep, we're that same person. But that person who was with us on this journey, you also have to remember that, that they're taking it at the same time, and they're going to hit pits and valleys along the way too. And one of the things that I found is that I'm not always the best at, I get into this point where I'm feeling really good, and then I forget to watch where she is. And so that, if anything, is probably led us to those kind of low points. In any relationship, you have high points and low points, and it's no different when you make the decision to transition. But it's just a matter of trying to keep that connection and keep the communications process going. I guess that's probably a good stopping point too. If you want to, another question or anything you might have.
You really made it clear that you are making this journey hand in hand with your spouse.
Right.
So on this journey, are there any hesitations that you all have? Is there anything that you're particularly worried about with respect to your gender therapy and continuing transition?
Right. Yeah, I think we all, no matter where we are on that spectrum, we have fears that we have to deal with, and mine are probably very similar, Dee, to other people's. Initially it's that fear of discovery, that fear of rejection by a spouse or a partner or family. We just don't know how people are going to react to this kind of new person that we're becoming. And so, it took me quite a while to really kind of think about where I'm going and where we're going with my spouse, and what transition ultimately is going to look like. And I think one, transition never ends. It doesn't matter. As people, we continue to transition in our lives, throughout our lives. But this maybe is a little more drastic a transition than most. Therapy got me through a lot of, working and understanding who I was, accepting who I am, and helping me to kind of plot that way ahead. I was also helped by some very, very good people. I met a woman on a different site who reached out to me very early on after I had joined that site, and she transitioned about 8 years ago. And she's been an active partner for me in having someone to talk to. And so I'd encourage people, find someone out there. We're all willing, I think, to talk and to help. It's really part of what our community is and should do. But find someone like that you can talk to and share with, because I did. And there are days when Sam saved my life. That her being there helped pull me out of that pit. So I've gone through the therapy, and it helped me to learn and control the dysphoria to a large degree. It helped me to be more accepting of myself. My therapist told me, you're never gonna, unless you make a medical transition, and that's something that I've opted not to do, a full medical transition. I'm not doing surgeries. And so she said, look, short of that, you're never going to like your body. So what you need to figure out is, how do you make a truce with it? How do you just come to grips with that, right? So that when you look in the mirror, that's not where your focus goes. Your focus stays in what's behind your eyes, right? Who you are. And so she helped me to do that. She also helped me to kind of figure out the dysphoria and kind of said, look, you got to get to a point where it's like that nagging person who's sitting in the passenger seat of your car. They can't affect what you're doing, but they can certainly tell you how you should be driving. And so, that's how it got to be for me. It was there. It was always there, and it could always be a distraction. And so my wife and I worked, we talked, we continued through this process, this learning process, and still do. It's not going to stop. We're both going to continue to go through this. But I finally got to a point, a couple months ago, where where I said, I just can't get rid of the dysphoria. And I really don't want to spend my life, or how many years I have left. I don't know. I'm 70 now. Who knows how many years any of us have anytime. But I don't want to live my life with the distraction of the dysphoria. And the only way that I know I can start that process is if I begin gender affirming hormone therapy. And it was something that we had discussed kind of early, after I came out to her and decided it wasn't right. And now had that discussion again a couple months ago and said, yeah, okay, that's what I need to do it at this point. And so, that's where I've come to.
Well, now you've got the listeners sitting on the edge of their seats because they're wanting to hear what's going to come next. But you know what? We're going to stall you all. That's going to be the next episode with April as she tells us the rest of her story. Going to the doctor to embark on hormone therapy, what it was like to get that first pill, and what happened in her first 90 days of being on hormones. So we've got you hooked, and we're going to reel you in next time with our next episode. April, is there any other wisdom? And by golly, you've had a lot of it today. Is there anything else you'd like to leave the audience with today?
I guess just one thing, Dee, and that would be that no matter where you are on that spectrum, a beginning crossdresser or just even kind of thinking about it or fully transitioning, the key is you have to learn to love yourself, to accept who you are, to love yourself, and to forgive yourself any sins that you think you might have committed along the way. That's the first step, finding peace, happiness, and
Okay. April, it has definitely been my pleasure to share the stage with you today. I think this is really going to be a great enduring material for CDH and TGH. And on behalf of anybody who comes to watch this, thank you for opening your heart and your life and that of your wife to share your journey with us. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we're going to invite you back in the next couple of months when we come back with April to hear that next segment. Thank y'all. Good night.